I figure before we get too far into this whole thing, I should really explain what this all is. My vision for this project is to provide a primer that can teach you to improvise in the jazz idiom. Now, I'm mainly aiming this at guitarists for what I would hope are obvious reasons, but this stuff really applies to all instruments. Now, this channel, well, at least the series of videos on this channel, isn't necessarily for rank beginners. I'm going to go out on a limb and assume that you've got at least a basic level of knowledge on subjects like harmony, theory, technique, that sort of thing. You'd also maybe get a bit more out of this series if you have at least a basic ability to read in standard notation. But if you're a guitar player, it's not strictly required, since I'm going to be including tab and chord diagrams for every example herein. Now, I do a lot of private instruction, both online and in person in the city where I live, and as a result, I've spent just a ton of time thinking about how to teach other people how to improvise. Now, the way that I learned was through obscenely long hours spent learning chord scales, listening to and transcribing solos by the greats, and then experimenting with those things that I learned in order to discover my own voice. I need to stress that this part of the process is still absolutely essential to get the most out of what I'm about to lay out here. I'm sure most of you have seen some ads here on this platform or maybe elsewhere online claiming to be the only thing that you'll ever need to unlock the fretboard or some other nonsense. Unfortunately, there's no magic method that's going to turn you into a brilliant improviser. I gotta tell you, regardless of the method, it's going to take effort, attention to detail, and care. But it's been my experience that a lot of what goes into being a great improviser comes from making discoveries on your own and learning to play similar to how you learn to speak your native language. However, what I've decided to lay down in these videos is an approach that's more tied to learning the rules of jazz improv through the lens of the standard rep tunes that we should all know. Each of these explorations is going to follow a core structure that's going to consist of the following steps. First, we'll learn the melody as a chord solo. Now, this is how I would play most of this material with a trio consisting of bass and drums. Playing the melody as single notes is always an option, but here we'll be taking a look at a more maximalist approach to playing the tune. Next, we'll discuss scale and chord substitution options, as well as methods to practice through the tune with them to learn how this would work in an actual improvisation. And last, we'll learn an improvised solo that consists of as many of the rules and conventions of jazz improv as possible. Keep in mind, though, that all the solos you're going to hear in this series won't be improvised in any way. They're all deliberately composed by me in order to illustrate how a good improviser weaves their way through a set of changes. My thinking is that we'll cover some of this in depth, but that you should really make some of these discoveries on your own in order to fully grasp how to be able to play stuff like this freely and in the moment. Now, without any further ado, I present to you the first in what I hope to be a long and ongoing series of exploratory deep dives into the standard jazz rep. I hope this tune and the etude that I've written for it can serve as a sort of baseline level of knowledge for you in your quest to become a better soloist. And at the very least, maybe you'll come away with a couple of new licks to add to your arsenal, or perhaps a new way of playing the melody and voicing the chords. Now let's dive into the classic introductory standard of Autumn Leaves. Now, this song serves as a fantastic entry point into the world of jazz harmony because of its relatively simple harmonic structure and its easy to follow AABC form. This tune is also almost a perfect example of a progression that's based solely around the circle of fifths and using sequences of 2 5s to create its harmonic movement. We'll be doing our study in the key that Miles played it in, G minor. Now, let's start off with learning the melody as a chord solo. A quick aside before we properly begin. If you're not hip to the six diminished concept developed by Barry Harris, I highly suggest that you go check out the series of videos from his famous masterclasses. And even better, you can go check out the fantastic Deep Dive for Guitarists by Robbie Barnby here on YouTube. He goes way in depth on the concept, its application, and its implications for guitarists, and it's absolutely incredible and very thorough and well thought out. I highly recommend checking that one out. The links are down in the description below. For my purposes here, I'll assume that you've got at least a top-level understanding of the concept, and maybe you've checked out some of the scale as chords, but aren't sure how exactly it applies to real-world playing situations. As we go through my treatment of this melody, I'll point out what sixth diminished scale that I'm using as a substitute for what chord movement, or what sixth chord I'm using as a substitute for any other chord. And I hope you'll get an idea of just how genius and versatile this is as a system for improvisers. Now, let's move on to the chord solo. Let's have a listen to what the chord solo sounds like first, and then we'll pick it apart one piece at a time. So I started things out fairly simple by stating the melody as single notes on the moving part of each phrase, followed by a chord with the melody note on the top for these long held notes that complete our short two-measure phrases. And nothing too crazy happening here yet, but I do want to point out the use of this minor 6 instead of a G minor 7 in bar 8. Despite being kind of a tense chord, it feels more resolved, final, and most importantly, more minor than just this plain old minor 7 with the third on top, which I could have easily used. It's at the second ending, moving into the B section, that things start to get more interesting. Here, over the 5/1 cadence coming out of the restatement of the A section, I use this E flat 6 diminished to harmonize the melody before resolving it down to B flat 6. For the pickup leading into the bridge, it's B flat 6 diminished all the way. For this A half diminished chord, I'm thinking C minor 6, but then just hanging this D note out to dry so things don't get too clunky. It's more B flat 6 diminished for the 5/1 cadence at bars 14 and 15 again. This time though, I staggered the bass note to give things a little bit of rhythmic interest and not make everything feel too consistently homophonic. Heading into the second half of the bridge, it's more B flat 6 diminished, followed by E flat 6 in place of that C minor 7 in bar 17. The same treatment here as earlier, where I'll just hang this F note out to dry so it's both easier to play and less clunky sounding. In bar 18, I used this chord, which I absolutely love. It's an alteration on this chord, which, quick bit of trivia, is my all-time favorite dominant 13 voicing. It saw me swap out the 13th for the melody note of F, and then drop the natural 9 down to a flat 9 for just a little bit more crunch and tension. From there, I resolved the phrase down to this B flat major 7, or, put in Barry's language, a B flat 6 with one borrowed diminished note. Coming into the C section at measure 20, I use E flat 6 with the borrowed diminished note on the top to fit the melody, and then this minor 2/5 is C minor 6 to B flat 6 diminished. Now for the consecutive 2/5, I did my level best to keep the melody note on top for as long as I possibly could, and then just played the guide tones, or the thirds and sevens, for the changes before using another combination of C minor 6, B flat 6 diminished to finish the tune. But again, I ended it on a G minor 6 because, like I said earlier, it just sounds more minor to me than the straight up minor 7 does. Have a listen to what this sounds like up to tempo with the bass and drums. Now, I hope you can hear that there's nothing really super outlandish happening in terms of the voicing, but just by making use of some of these substitution principles inherent within the sixth diminished concept, you can voice tunes like this in a way that emphasizes movement over static 2 to 5. Let's now move on to the solo etude and a set of chords to work on your comping with. For the first 4 bars of the chord comp, I decided to keep things pretty simple. In fact, the whole thing is almost entirely drop 2 chords. C minor 7 in root position starts us out in bar 1. Then we move to F7 drop 2, second inversion, which keeps the E flat in common on the top. And then we resolve down to this B flat major 7 drop 2 in root position. As much as you can, you should really try to use half steps like this to resolve chord movements. They just sound really smooth and really nice. Here, I just like the sound of this E flat major 9, so I just used that. Most of you are probably pretty familiar with this chord shape. It's moving ahead that things start to get a little strange and where the sixth diminished concept starts to really take over. Starting in bar 5, I subbed in a C minor 6 for A half diminished, E flat minor 6 in place of D dominant flat 9, and B flat 6 in place of G minor 7. These are pretty common substitutions, but allow me to explain a little further. Look at this A half diminished chord. It's really just a minor triad on the top, C minor, with its sixth in the bass, which is A. Next, D7 flat 9, for which I use this E flat minor 6, gives us a D7 flat 13 flat 9 sound. It's super crunchy. This one is a pretty common sub for dominant 7 chords. Minor 6 off the flat 2 works really good for 7 flat 9 sounds, and then if we did minor 6 off the 5th, you would just get straight dominant 7. And finally, this resolves into a really nice B flat 6 in place of G minor 7. These same substitution principles are going to come up again and again, so try to view them from a perspective like this and apply some sort of sensible rule to them. First, the half diminished chord is really just minor 6 off the 3rd, or put another way, it's a minor 6 in 3rd inversion with the 6th in the bass. Next, dominant flat 9 is had by playing minor 6 off the flat 9, or flat 2, however you prefer to look at this. And minor 7 is achievable a number of ways, but most readily from the major 6 off of the minor 3rd of the chord in question. For the second A section, I decided to move things up in the register and play this E flat 6 in place of C minor 7, resolve that B flat down to an A, which gives me C minor 6, which is really F7, and then I played this F6 in place of B flat major 7, which keeps the A on top. Then rounded out the phrase by playing this B flat 6 in place of E flat major 7. For the last 4 of the second A, I used the same subs as I did the first time. C minor 6 is A half diminished, E flat minor 6 is D7 flat 9, and B flat 6 is G minor 7. Moving into the bridge, it's a similar story. A half diminished is a C minor 6, but then I use a C diminished for D dominant. Now, where'd that come from? Well, the interesting thing about each sixth diminished scale is that it contains not only the dominant, but also the dominant of its relative minor. So really, for this dominant chord, I'm thinking about B flat sixth diminished, but through the lens of its relative minor, which is G. And then, lo and behold, this C diminished drops down to B flat 6, which is really my G minor 7. Moving out of the bridge, I decided to use a borrowed dominant to get to the C minor 7. Now this is just something I like to do. From G minor 7 I went like this. I played the B flat 6 in place of G minor 7, and then again. But then, moving into the C minor 7, I played this G dominant flat 9, for which I just subbed in a B diminished. And then that moves me up to the C minor 7. It's basically, leading tone diminished. Sounds great. Now, this C minor 7 voicing I'm sure you're familiar with, but in this line of thinking, again, it's really just E flat 6 in 3rd inversion, with the 6th in the bass. For the next F7, it's again C minor 6, then F6, even though this feels and sounds like a D minor 7 chord, and then B flat 6, even though it sounds like this bog standard G minor 7. For the last couple phrases, I used C minor 6 again in place of A half diminished, E flat minor 6 again in place of D7 flat 9, and then for the consecutive 2 5s, it's B flat 6 to G minor 6, and then I repeated the same move down a whole step, which gives me A flat 6 to F minor 6. Finally, finish the tune off with the same minor cadence as before. C minor 6, E flat minor 6, B flat 6. Keep in mind, this is just playing block chords as whole notes too. You could move all of these chords around inside of their respective 6 diminished scales as chords for a busier comp. You could also choose to borrow notes above and below for even more variation. Once you really start to get inside this concept, the harmonic possibilities are almost endless and hugely more interesting than just using our standard grips all the time. Be sure to practice these chord grips on the beat so you can hear how the substitutions function in time. Do the same moves on multiple string groups instead of just the ones I've demonstrated here. Change the voicing style from these drop 2 chords to maybe double drop 2, drop 4, drop 3, and beyond. You'll find a lot of interesting moves by doing this. Take some of your favorite cadences too and move them around in all 12 keys. Really, the more time you spend inside of this system, the more freely you'll be able to accompany yourself as well as others. Let's move on and check out some single note scales and arpeggios that we can apply to these chord changes. As far as scales are concerned, there's a ton of things to consider. First and foremost, we should keep in mind that when improvising, our goal is to play a melody that reflects the chord changes and not just playing bar to bar. That is always going to lead to uninteresting results. So don't get too entirely hung up on playing each scale or arpeggio to completion over a given chord. The point of knowing these is really just to be able to access different harmonic resolutions between chords. Here's some things that I try to consider when I'm playing over this tune. For the first 4 bars of the tune, we are squarely within the key of B-flat major. C minor 7 is the Dorian mode, F7 is Mixolydian, yes, but these all come from and lead to the same place, and that's B-flat. In fact, the E-flat also does as well, but we have the option here of playing a B-flat 7 scale over this because of where we go next, that being the A half diminished. Moving through the tune to that minor 2-5 cadence, which starts with A half diminished, we can think of a few things. First would be the most basic. That's just a Locrian mode, which, hey, that's just more B-flat. This can work fine, it's just not super colorful. A hipper option would be to try out one of Barry's scales and play around with the C minor 6 diminished. This contains both the harmonic minor, the melodic minor, and the dominant of both itself and its relative majors, so there's just a ton of harmonic ground to cover here. D7 flat 9, I like to play this dominant scale, which is really just G harmonic minor, played from D. For all you theory nerds out there, that is a Phrygian dominant scale. And finally, for G minor 7, we can again think of a Barry scale, a G minor 6 diminished to be exact, because again, it contains both of the altered minor scales, harmonic and melodic, and its own dominant. Plus, that natural 6 really evokes that mysterious Dorian quality that everybody loves so much. The only other thing we need to consider harmonically in this tune is that devilish consecutive 2-5. Well, really, it's much simpler than it appears on the surface. We can just ignore that 2 chord in each bar and just see this as a sequence of descending dominants. The 2 chord and its 5 chord are basically interchangeable anyway, so for simplicity's sake, we'll just play some C dominant and B flat dominant scales here. Based on these 1-octave scale shapes that I've demonstrated here, I think you should be able to extract arpeggios from them in every chord. But just in case, check out these positions. All these are in root position, which means we start from the root and then play 3-5-7. To be able to play with total freedom, you should also practice the inversions of all of these 4-note arpeggios. So that's practicing root 3-5-7, then 3-5-7-1, 5-7-1-3, 7-1-3-5. As far as practicing this stuff over the tune, there's a lot of ways we can do that. The simplest way is just to play each chord scale ascending only to the 7th when the chord lasts for 1 bar, and in both directions when the chord lasts for 2 bars. Lucky for us, this tune almost entirely consists of 1 chord per bar changes. Here's what that exercise would sound like in practice. I would also practice these from each chord tone for every chord. So practice this from the root, the 3rd, the 5th, and the 7th. As far as arpeggios, the strategy is the same. Practice them over the changes, but in one direction only, and then switch directions on another pass. That would sound like this. Finally, we can come up with a pattern like this. We'll play an arpeggio up from the root, descend the scale, and put in either 2, 3, or no half steps in order to land on an appropriate chord tone in the next bar. This would end up making us play pretty consistently 2-measure phrases. That would sound like this. As with everything, we want to be able to practice this from each chord tone. That's root, third, fifth, and seventh. This will give us a lot more freedom than just practicing everything from the root all the time. Obviously, there's countless other ways to practice melodic ideas over changes. These are but a few, and we'll cover many more in future videos. Now let's move on to the sample solo. All right, it's time for what I'm sure has really brought you here today. Now, rather than taking you through every move I made in painstaking detail, I figure I'll just do a playthrough of that solo, and you can follow along with the notation down at the bottom of the screen. This one, being essentially Etude 1 in a series of who knows how many, I decided I'd keep things rhythmically pretty simple. It's almost entirely made up of continuous eighth notes so that you can see how to navigate a set of chord changes in a maximalist way. Let's have a listen to what this thing sounds like now. Alright, so there is an absolute ton to unpack in here, but I'll just stick to pointing out some of the things that I like best, and then we can try our hand at snipping out a few key licks and seeing how they work in isolation. So right out of the gate, if we look at this thing from a bird's eye view, we get a nice contour that sort of looks like this. Now, a good solo will tend to follow this kind of an arc. We've got our initial takeoff, some mild intensity, but then it drops off coming out of the second A section. Going into the bridge, it's a steady climb upwards toward the climax when we hit the C section, where we then hit the highest note in the solo before winding our way back downwards towards the end. When we're improvising, this is a good thing to keep in the back of our mind. A good solo is like a good story, in that we don't want everything to be too samey all the time. There should be ebbs and flows, peaks and valleys, and then some sort of climactic moment, followed by a gradual drop-off of intensity, until we then send the tune off to the next person in the group who gets to tell their story about the changes. As far as all the note-to-note stuff, let's take a look at a couple of key moments. Overall, I wanted to stick really tightly to this idea of resolving to either a third or a seventh of a particular chord on the downbeat, as that is one of the best ways to make our lines sound like they land right and make them sound more intentional. Let's take a look at the first 4 bars in particular. Starting off, we'll hit this minor ninth arpeggio and then surround the third of the next chord, F7. And that right there is a super strong resolution, and this itself could be considered a lick that we then move around to some other keys, but let's not stop here. From the third of that F7, we'll walk down using some half steps until we get to the 7th, and then surround the third of the B flat major 7th. Let's have one more listen to all that and follow along with the notation. This 3-bar 2-5-1 would make a fantastic exercise to move around in all 12 keys. However, I still kept the line going by outlining a B flat major 7th arpeggio, using the 7th as a lower neighbor tone to the root. Once I hit the 7th on beat 4, I chose to surround the 3rd of the next chord in the same manner from before, and then played some straight up E flat major scale to work my way down towards the A half diminished. Even though in this key it should be E flat Lydian, I deliberately used E flat major because the A flat that we get on the 4th there resolves nicely into the 7th of A half diminished that comes next. Here's what those first 4 measures sound like, slow, resolving into that half diminished chord. Let's take a look at another 4 bars later on at the end of the bridge. Starting out on the 5th of the C minor 7, I just walked up the scale to the 3rd before turning around to come back down and hit the 3rd of F7 by way of the 7th of C minor. From there, I decided to climb back upwards towards B flat by using just a little bit of chromaticism to bridge the gap. The 6th of a chord here isn't particularly strong, but I think I saved it by landing on this A on beat 2, which is the 7th, and playing this kind of combination scale arpeggio thing to come back down before then jumping back up by a 4th to the 7th of E flat, which is D. I could have ended the phrase here, but I wanted something a little less discordant, so then I escaped to the 6, which gave me some rhythmic interest and a better resolution, I think. Let's listen to what those 4 bars sound like in isolation. Remember, this is just one way of getting through the changes, and it's very formulaic at that, right? In the wild, we'd ideally have more than one chorus to work out our ideas, as well as the freedom to make things more rhythmically interesting. However, we should always strive to play something that reflects the chords as closely as possible, so that even unaccompanied, we can hear the harmony being implied by the lines that we play. I would really encourage you to play this without the accompaniment and see if you can hear the changes underneath. Once you've got all this under your fingers, try writing some lines on these changes yourself. Stick to making sure that chord tones land on downbeats and you let your ear, not your brain, guide you through. Lastly, I want to point out some quick things about articulation and swing feel here. Swing feel is not just about making things sound like triplets, although that is a big part of it. More of it comes from where we put the accent, as well as where we choose to articulate and where to slur, or hammer on and pull off. I've indicated slur markings for all the places where I deliberately used a left-hand slur between 2 notes instead of a pick attack. This kind of articulation goes a long way to making things sound more natural. Check out those first 4 bars again, and hear the difference between continuous pick attacks and the natural articulation I've indicated. If you've stuck around to the end of this video, I really hope that you've learned something, or at least found this entertaining in some way. Maybe you found more insight into something you already knew, but were able to make practical use of that information after seeing this. Whatever value it is that you found here, I would love to hear from you. What tunes would you like to see explored in future? Are there any particular concepts or techniques that you found especially challenging during your time learning to improvise? Drop a comment down below and let me know. If you enjoyed what you saw here, be sure to like and subscribe and hit that bell for notifications. I'll be doing my best to get deep dives like this out on a monthly basis, with maybe some smaller videos in between, so definitely watch this space for more content. If you found this especially helpful, why not share it around with some of your friends? It sure helped me out and I would really appreciate it. If you're looking for more of a monetary way to support what I'm doing here, I've also started a Patreon as a companion to this channel, where I'll be offering PDFs of all the material in these videos, as well as some bonus extras for higher tier subs. From the bottom of my heart, I want to say thank you to all of you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.